Alright, so here's my official tier list for the Turtle Pack or Standard Pack and Super Auto Pets. I have played this game for probably over 2,000 hours. I'm currently top 5 in ELO at around 1989, which is currently 4th, so I feel like I somewhat know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about Standard Pack, because that's pretty much mostly what I play when it comes to ranked. So let's go ahead and start. It is divided by tiers, with the best pets being on the left and the worst pets being on the right. So at tier 1, we have Duck as the best pet in the game. It's a 2-3, plus just the huge advantage you can get from the stats. You can sell ducks onto peacocks and whatever tier 3 usually get upon level up, and it's just a huge advantage in stats. Shrimp is actually mouse. You are going to probably lose the first 2 rounds, but you regen one anyway, so it's usually not like a huge problem. And then again, the extra stats, you're just able to get like immediately some good stats on maybe ox or a camel, or you get extra stats from rabbit, or you go like big dodo, so it just ends up being really good. Beaver is pretty similar, but it's attack, which can be helpful, but there's a lot of hurt synergies in turtle pack, so generally health is nicer at the start. Pig is just a good little thing to get extra gold. Ant is pretty good for tempo, just to win the early rounds if you really care about that. Fish has dropped off a little bit because it's a little awkward to get the fish buffs onto actually good pets. You'd have to get like a different tier up first, or you'd have to like roll into peacock first, which is not always gonna happen, but fish is still decent at 2-3. Then we have horse. You can go horse cricket if you get it, just decent tempo, maybe horse sheep, and then you just, I mean, you can kind of pivot out of summons. You don't have to, since summons are a very valid way to win. And it's not terrible to start with, but you're not going to have the advantage of getting a bunch of early stats. Mosquito, generally not super helpful in this pack anymore, since like camel and peacock are so prevalent that usually doesn't end up actually helping you out. And yes, then cricket, which is mostly just helpful for horse, but maybe you can go like cricket in the back in some spots. And then otter, usually the stats are pretty irrelevant, unfortunately, because you're just buffing tier 1s that you're going to sell anyway. And it's bad tempo, which, by the way, just means it's bad on the turn that you buy it. Like, trying to win with tempo just means you're playing to win that round. Like, the best example is just buying a cupcake. You get temporary stats, and you're just trying to win that round. Whereas the opposite is usually scaling and going for more long-term wins. Alright, so at tier 2, at the top of the list, we have Peacock. It is just so hard to stop a big peacock. Really, the only thing you can do is get skunks, but skunk's not until tier 4, so what do you do until then? Well, there's not really too much. It's also a pretty good counter to, like, camel, just big peacock with garlic, maybe feed it something with rabbits, and it's really hard to stop. Flamingo is good tempo, plus you can pill it and get stats, just ends up being a really solid tier 2. Snail ends up being a great scaler since you have 5 lives to work with. You could get 4 snail stats, so it ends up being a good scaler at tier 2. Usually just a take. Spiders are just good for pills. Because tier 3s are so solid in turtle pack, just taking spider pills usually is pretty good on turns 3 and 4. It is a little bit of a gamble. Maybe you'll get like a 2-2 elephant or a 2-2 badger, but even that could be actually helpful because if you on turn 5 just roll into a badger or elephant, then that helps you out in just getting those tier ups on turn 7 maybe. Kangaroo, a solid buff target if you're going with like duck strats or something. Put it behind a kangaroo, put it behind an ox, put it behind a peacock, ends up being a pretty solid unit overall. It's maybe not something you want to commit to the entire game since like it does fall off but eventually, but solid option for a tier 2. Swan is risky. Its benefit is pretty big. Like if you can get a level 2 swan, that is very nice, but at the same time it can cost you a lot of tempo. Maybe you'll lose a couple extra lives because you took swan, and is it really worth it? It kind of depends on the situation. So swan is, you know, risky but can pay off nicely. Worm is the exact same thing. Like level 1 worm is pretty useless. You can maybe buy him on like apples, 2 gold apples on turn 3 or 4. But unless if you get level 2 worm, then it really doesn't feel like it's any advantage whatsoever. But if you do happen to get that level 2 worm, then suddenly you get a discounted pair pretty much. And that's pretty solid overall. Especially if you happen to get a food build going with rabbit, maybe squirrel or seal or something. It can end up working really well with those, but it's also not great tempo since it has pretty bad stats at the start. Hedgehog is not really that bad. If you get early camel, maybe you have a peacock, you can just take it for a couple turns, or maybe just tempo someone out with a good hedgehog camel build. And they recently gave it one more attack, which I don't know if that was needed, but hey, it's a solid tempo option. Dirty Rat is, I would say, just the worst version of Hedgehog, where it's like you can kind of tempo, but it can also help out the opponent's team by giving a melon to the Ox. It can give, like, I don't know, extra triggers to stuff. It's kind of risky and maybe not really worth it in most spots. It is a 3-6 or whatever it is, so sometimes you can take it, but most of the time I try to avoid it. And then Crab, I think you pretty much never take. It is just one of the worst pets in the game, I think. All right, at tier 3, this is where things get really interesting because a lot of times the game will revolve around tier 3s. You really just want to try to get all your level ups on turn 3 for the early tier 3s, and these will be a pretty big game changer. So Ox, reason at the top of the list, no counterplay pretty much. Big Ox is prevented, or it's good against Skunk. It's good against, like, it just anything. You can get a lot of attack when you pill stuff in front of it, like flamingos. Overall, just such a good buff target, and getting early Ox is going to give you quite an advantage. But early Camel is also very deadly because it is such good tempo as well, where getting those extra 2-2s will probably win you those rounds, and it works so well with Rabbit. And also it can work with Ox if you go Ox and Camel. It just ends up being such a good unit overall. And as long as your Camel is bigger than, like, the biggest thing on the opponent's team, it is hard to stop until Skunk. And you can't always rely on just finding skunks. Rabbit is the best scaler on tier 3. We got Rabbit Salad, which just gives you a big amount of stats. With the hurt synergies, it just ends up working really well. And then later on, you know, level 2 Rabbit, you can buy like sushis, get a ton of stats that way as well. Maybe have some cows, just overall really solid. Dodo is perhaps a slight counter. I did say, like, most of the counters are skunk, but you can go Dodo to counter Big Peacock or Big Camel, but it is pretty difficult to get a ton of attack onto Dodo. You can try to feed it with, like, a Rabbit or try to get a Giraffe behind it. Maybe you get early Giraffe, early Dodo, and then it's great. And it also works great behind Ox, of course, so it is still a top tier unit and a great buff target. Giraffe, very solid just as a scaler. Getting those extra 1-1 buffs can be, you know, the difference between winning and losing. It is just nice to get early scaling. Once you have the scaling advantage, hard for your opponent to catch up sometimes. Dog is a great tempo option. You get early Dog, you can sell mice, you get a whole bunch of stats from that, which you kind of want to do anyway. You can get spiders, maybe you take a sheep in there, and yeah, you can get a ton of attack. That's actually possibly another counter to Peacock and Camel. I should have said the only counter was Skunk, because Dodo and Dog can kind of counter it as well. Dolphin is just nice against Scorpion, since Scorpion you really can lose, like, to just cheesy Scorpion plays where you have a big unit with Garlic, it just dies to Scorpion if it's positioned perfectly. So having that protection is pretty nice and decent tempo. Then we have Badger, very position heavy, but not a terrible buff target. It can certainly get a ton of value at level 2 if you have the right positioning, maybe knock out 2 of their biggest pets, or go Honey Badger. You can always do that. Sheep, I mean, you can go Horse Sheep. Maybe it's okay tempo as well, since it's kind of like a 6-6 in stats. Not too bad there. And then Elephant is not that bad. Even if it's last in this list, it's pretty takeable. You have a 3-7, which is decent base stats. And because Camel is so good, Elephant Camel is a decent option. If you happen to get level 2 Elephant, level 2 Camel, and maybe find a Turtle, then suddenly it's really, really difficult to stop. At tier 4, top of the list, we have Turtle. Melon can be a huge difference, you know, it just ends up being a massive game changer. The difference between winning and losing, maybe it's just finding Melon versus the other person not finding Melon. So yeah, best equipment in the game. Penguin, such a nice scaler. Getting 2 level 2s and getting a Penguin can be such a big advantage, and just it makes your opponent feel hopeless sometimes. It just ends up being so good, especially if it's something like an Ox or maybe a Camel. And it spreads out the stats, so it is resistant against Skunk, which is one of the best abilities in the game. One of the ways to win without scaling is to go Skunk and then maybe get some tempo tier 6s, such as Snake or Fly, and you can kind of beat the scaling teams out. The other option, I guess, would be Summits. And then Parrot is great because you can just get a tier 6 with level 2 Parrot, and immediately you get to Parrot Snake or Parrot Fly, Parrot whatever it is, and that ends up being a lot of extra stats right there. Deer, great with summons. Turkey is now +3/+2, which is probably a slight buff. It also I mean, just the extra attack, it is more susceptible to snipes, so the counterplay is like super effective against it. But if they don't have any counterplay, just a ton of damage instantly if you happen to get like parrot turkey with a bunch of deers. Hippo, now a 4/7, you know, get an early hippo with garlic. It's not too bad, kind of hard to stop sometimes. And then whale, very nice base stats now, even more buffs. So whale deer is super good for just destroying teams in like turn 7 or earlier. And then blowfish, not exactly the best unit, but hey, it exists and its ability can be helpful. Maybe you go elephant blowfish and you kill some summon teams. It can happen. Bison, you don't really go for a lot of level 3s, unfortunately, so you don't usually want to keep it around. And its scaling got nerfed where it's like, it's not going to be an instant win if you get early bison anymore, so it's pretty rare you actually get that going. And squirrel, really, I feel like the only situation you take squirrel is if you get like level 2 worm or something. Maybe you get that 1 gold apple instead of 2 gold apple, but it can work out, maybe if you have the perfect food build. Moving on to tier 5. At the top of the list, we have Shark. Man, if you can get early Shark, it is good tempo, plus you can find pills in the shop, and it's great scaling. So good tempo and good scaling means it's just both best of both worlds. What can you do to stop it? I guess Croc, maybe, but if you find enough pills, you quickly get out of Croc range, and it's pretty nasty. It's hard to stop Shark. The only problem is you have to find pills, but still. Monkey, just overall great scaling. Only downside, of course, very predictable positioning. Sometimes you're just always putting your strongest pet in front. Maybe it's susceptible to scorpion, skunk, that kind of stuff, but still a great scaler. Turkey, it can be good for pivoting. It can be good for summons to just like instantly get a pretty big power spike. So if it looks like you're really far behind in scaling, you pivot to summons. That's one of the ways to win. Or you just take it for a 2 gold plus 3/2. Scorpion, very cheesy, but if they don't have melon, can just scam out those wins. And nowadays, there's Armadillo in this pack, which is not actually here, but Armadillo probably, I actually haven't really thought about it, but maybe behind Rooster or so. But Armadillo Scorpion can be hard to stop. If especially maybe like Parrot Armadillo Scorpion, you can get a ton of HP. And if they don't have any melon or like counterplay to it, it is tough to stop sometimes. So cow, just 2/4 for 2 gold, a lot of stats. Maybe you get a seal in there, maybe you have rabbit, it's even more stats. Maybe you hit early cat. It can be a great overall just increase in stats. Very efficient. Croc, you know, good tempo, can take out Shark, maybe take out something like that as well. If you get enough Crocs, or like it can counter summons, of course, then it can be really hard to play around. So just enough Crocs maybe to wipe out entire teams. Rooster, it's a good buff target, but it comes pretty late. And 1v1s, typically the game's ending not super late, so you won't actually get like a massive Rooster or get it to like level 2 or level 3. So it's not exactly the best thing in the game. Seal, Rabbit Seal is a strat, but like its scaling is pretty minimal. It feels like it's pretty situational, where sometimes it'll be good if you happen to have that Worm Rabbit team or something, but a lot of times it's not amazing. Rhino is actually a decent summon counter as well. It's got good base stats. I don't know if it really deserves to be last, because there are situations where Rhino is just good, and it certainly can be useful. But that's, I guess, a good sign, where everything on tier 5 is kind of viable in some situations. So tier 6 is mostly just going to be tempo. Because this is a tier list for 1v1s, the game ends, you know, turn 11 maybe, so you're pretty much just unlocking tier 6s, or you're taking the early tier 6s, so you really just want things for tempo, and unless if you drew a ton of early stuff, in which case, like, the scalers are going to be moved up a bit, but usually it doesn't last that long. So we have Snake at the top, just a lot of extra damage. You put it behind your tank, you can get a couple shots off, and that damage can really add up. Fly, it can pop melons, get rid of stakes, do a lot of things. It can also be great with Shark, or it can feed into like a camel or a peacock. I mean, it can be sometimes not useful, but overall just a solid amount of stats. Mammoth, same thing. You can also pill it, of course, but just a solid amount of stats with Mammoth in the front. That can help out quite a bit. Boar is the most amount of attack you can get just right away. Instant 14 attack. Maybe you have a melon and then you can get 18 attack. That can certainly be helpful for just winning like one round. Cat is a great scaler in theory, but you usually don't have a ton of time to actually use Cat. but if you happen to get like a cow, that's also great. And then as long as you have enough lives, it is going to be a pretty significant advantage. Dragon, again, in 1v1s, you're probably not going to get a ton of value out of it, so you might just get some level 1 dragon scaling, but if you happen to have a dog game as well, can work really well with that and just kind of finish them out. Leopard, good against summons, but again, such a late thing in the game, you're probably not going to have a ton of time to scale it, but, you know, it depends on the game. Gorilla, same thing. Coconut can be super useful, but maybe it's also a bit risky because you don't always get the coconut. And then Tiger, useful for like Snake, maybe Leopard, maybe something like that, but a lot of situations you probably don't really need it. Anyway, that's it for my tier list. Thanks for watching. Let me know your own feedback, your own opinions about this tier list in the comments, and see ya.